it's not just invulnerability. It's if they face an existential challenge, would they be willing to use a nuclear weapon in order to justify their extremist ideology in the waning days of their regime? My name is Mark Wallace. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of United Against Nuclear Iran, a former American diplomat.
Okay, well, let's start with a simple question around the current situation involving Israel, Iran, Lebanon, Hezbollah. Where do you see this situation at the moment? Is this the beginning? Is it the middle? Are we close to the end?
I think we're coming to the climax. I think that after I was speaking to some colleagues in the national security community this morning, and the regime has been around since 78, 79, and I think really the intensity of this shadow conflict has been going on 25, 30 years. And I sense that it's coming to a head right now because for far too long, the West has wanted to stick its head in the sand and indulge Iran's prevarications, its lies, its overstatement. And I think Iran is being revealed for its lies. It didn't need a nuclear program for so many reasons. It has some of the largest oil and gas reserves. Its so-called support of all these proxies was actually quite malign. And what's revealing is that these proxies are the cannon fodder of the regime. The regime is tenuously holding to power in Iran. The Ayatollah is facing a dramatic succession moment. There's only been 2 Ayatollahs in history. The question is, will there be a third? And it sure seems to me that the Iranians are only concerned about clinging to power, exercising dominion over the Iranian people, while trying to convince their proxies that they're behind them. And this missile attack last night, while largely ineffective, was the largest ballistic missile attack of any country on another country in history. And I think it brings it to a climax. Finally, I think certainly Israel is going to strike back. And I think the United States will be compelled to support those strikes and participate in them in some way. My colleague, Governor Jeb Bush, and I put out a statement calling unequivocally for Israel, with the support of the United States, to strike a comprehensive array of Iranian military targets, from IRGC facilities, missile facilities, to their nuclear facilities. That must happen. And if it doesn't, we are making the world a much more dangerous place. But this moment is, frankly, the moment that culminates in years of failed American deterrence. And those chickens are coming home to roost.
Who's to blame for that failed American deterrence that you talk about?
Some of it is the American people. I think that, and it's not a criticism. It's actually, this is a nationalistic expression of my fellow countrymen. I think there's this perception that America is some sort of a colonial or occupying power, but we're really not. The American people are very much isolationists, tend to their own homes and our country. And only in crisis do we respond and engage in extraterritorial action. But I think that the left has, and the Biden administration and the Obama administration, have overplaced the efficacy of diplomacy. Look, there are only a few tools in the tool shed. I am a former diplomat. I certainly believe in diplomacy. But when you think about it, there are only a few things you can do to confront a terrible international challenge: diplomacy, military planning preparation, asymmetrical warfare like cyber and the like, and some type of special operations, and economic warfare, meaning sanctions. A sound policy would prepare and indulge in all of those so that you had all the tools in the tool shed ready. I think because of our American political system being very polarized, and I think our general isolationist tendencies, I think the Democratic administrations and the Republican administration, the Trump administration, have been unnecessarily isolationist. And when you're that isolationist, you try to kick the can down the road, but ultimately that can confronts a problem, and you have to deal with it. And that's what's happening right now in Iran.
that sort of primary desire to look after your own, as you put it, I think is probably one of the main attractions, isn't it, of Donald Trump as a potential president once again in the next few weeks. Do you see the way that he handled Iran and its nuclear program in particular as one of the main reasons why we are here once again? And then on a slight separate tangent, do you think that the current situation with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris sort of campaigning, as it were, together for continued Democrat within the White House might actually involve kicking the can down the road yet again here? Because of course, if Israel goes back into Iran, if oil fields get hit, we talk about increasing oil costs, and that hits the man on the street, which don't look good for a Democrat candidate, does it?
Well, there's a lot in that question, inappropriately a lot. I mean, you asked a lot of good points, but there's a lot in there. Look, I don't believe the oil issue. I've been dealing with this issue for many, many years. I remember testifying before Congress in, I think, 2012 on the fact what was called oil shock. And what you just projected was oil shock. That somehow that Iranian oil taken out of the market would somehow impact prices. Look, Iranian oil is sanctioned. It largely goes to China at highly reduced rates. There's plenty of oil in the market, and oil traders have factored that into the price. And the United States is a major oil exporter. So I think oil shock is entirely overblown, and I don't think that there will be an oil shock if Iranian oil is taken off the market. Look, the Trump administration and their maximum pressure campaign on Iran was, I think, a very smart policy. In fact, our organization, United Against Nuclear Iran, is in many ways the authors and patrons of that policy. We've been advocating economic pressure on that regime because its vulnerability to and its dependence on hydrocarbon revenues can put it into the red zone and create hyperinflation on their economy. Excuse me. That economy is clearly struggling, and as they face greater inflationary trends, the people who are wholly dissatisfied with this regime will have a greater tendency to rise up. So I think that the Trump administration policies on Iran were quite sound. I think that refusing to deal and face the reality of Iran's malign influence in the region is not just kicking down the can down the road. It is more dangerous because yesterday we saw the largest ballistic missile attack over a modern city of our great ally, Israel. That could have been avoided. And the longer you kick the can down the road, the more dangerous a problem becomes. And I think we're seeing that right now. And we shouldn't underestimate this. This is a dangerous moment. But if we don't act now, and Iran was able to develop a nuclear weapon with their industrial scale nuclear production facilities, we would be in a more dangerous place because they shot down, let's say, of those 180, they shot down the vast majority of them. What if a couple of them had nuclear fissile material on board? So, I think our policies, both Republican and Democrat, have been largely inadequate, but the Trump administration and their maximum pressure campaign in isolating Iran was helping to put Iran in the red zone and was a better policy. I think the Biden administration, while well-intended, total reliance on one of the tools in the tool shed, meaning diplomacy, without saying I'm opposed to diplomacy, is folly and has made the world a much more dangerous place because our enemies, like Iran, think that we are weak. We have failed to establish deterrence, and our allies question whether they can rely on us. Look, if we were talking at any time over the last 30 years that Iran was enriching uranium to 60% enrichment and launching ballistic missiles over Israel, I would have told you we would have been at war a long time ago. Republicans and Democratic presidents would have said that's unacceptable. But somehow we're in this place now because of that fundamental isolationist tendency in the American body politic, and frankly, the lack of deterrence in Democratic administrations.
In your answer there, you talk about that the Donald Trump policies. Of course, Tim Walz in the vice presidential debate yesterday was likely to always criticize it, but he actually said that because of what he described as fickle leadership by Trump, Iran is actually closer to a nuclear weapon than they were before. Do you not see that as the case right now?
I think that the politics of the nuclear issue on Iran is one of the regrettable areas of partisanship in the United States. For many, many years, the Iran nuclear file was a bipartisan issue. Look, President Obama ran and was elected on negotiating some sort of agreement. We looked at the JCPOA and waited, and that JCPOA was flawed. It left Iran with an industrial scale nuclear program. The centrifuges that they were spinning that are putting us in this position right now were made possible by that JCPOA. And shortly after the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was the Iran nuclear agreement at the time, shortly after entering that agreement, when President Obama's communication team, which I think regrettably contributed to the polarization because Ben Rhodes, his communications national security advisor, said anybody that opposed the JCPOA was a warmonger, and that was really wrong. And that Iran would somehow rejoin the community of nations if only we allowed them to enter into this nuclear agreement. That didn't happen. Shortly after entering into the agreement, Iran tested ballistic missiles in the region, terrifying its neighbors, the same ballistic missiles that we're seeing that are launched over Israel, and was spinning advanced centrifuges and had the capability of enriching highly enriched uranium. I think the JCPOA was a really flawed, bad deal, and no deal was better than that deal because it legitimized Iran's nuclear program. So if you ask me, without, and we run a bipartisan organization, we work with every president. I think President Obama was well-intended, but where we find ourselves right now can be placed more at the feet of President Obama's national security team that legitimized Iran's nuclear program in the JCPOA.
Okay, let's get into the detail then of the Iranian nuclear program, and we'll go to simplistics. How close do you believe Iran is to being able to build a nuclear bomb? And then secondly, Richard Spencer, the Times' former Middle East correspondent, wrote in his piece on this in the last 24 hours that if they did get that bomb, that would add a sense of sort of invulnerability to Iran. So how does that change the dynamic of what's going on in the Middle East if and when they do create their own nuclear weapon?
First of all, the estimates by the nuclear physicists are anywhere between 3 months and a year. I think the larger, more intellectually accessible point to your listeners and your viewers is that you can't unlearn something. And I think Iran has the capability. It's a question of whether or not they will be dissuaded from taking those steps to put the different elements together, whether it be a delivery system, an ignition system, and the enrichment capability into one process in a small enough model to be carried on a ballistic missile. And I think that's the question, whether they will take that step. But I think we have some pretty good intel, but I don't think it's good enough. But anywhere between a couple months and a year are the estimates. Look, Mr. Spencer's piece is accurate. I think it misses one point. Not only does it create invulnerability in the eyes of the Ayatollah, who is facing an existential crisis right now. He has no logical successor. A lot of his leadership has been lost because of the death of President Raisi and others. The only successors that are out there are despised by the Iranian people. The Iranian people are incredibly restive. They don't like their leaders anymore, and they're willing to say it. So I think it's not just invulnerability, but you have to understand the rise of something called the Mahdi, which is the purification of the Islamic Shia extremists around the Ayatollah. It's not just invulnerability. It's if they face an existential challenge, would they be willing to use a nuclear weapon in order to justify their extremist ideology in the waning days of their regime? It's not just invulnerability, but there is a little bit of a extremist death cult surrounding some of the philosophy of those around the Ayatollah.
Given the amount of time that you're talking about Iran could potentially have a nuclear weapon in, do you think that's why Israel has decided now is the time to go into Lebanon to really take this fight to Hezbollah. Because if they wait and that nuclear weapon turns up, as you're talking about, that does change the sort of game, as it were, as far as they're concerned. Do you think there was they could easily, couldn't they, have gone, right, we'll deal with Gaza, we'll finish with Hamas, and then we'll take a break and we'll revisit this another time? I just wonder whether the speed of this is because of that nuclear threat.
I disagree with that analysis. I think that certainly is a legitimate concern and might be an interesting and smart policy commentary. But I don't think that's the reality. Look, if Mexico invaded Texas and killed a bunch of our people, or Canada invaded Michigan, or Scotland invaded England, or God forbid, the Netherlands started launching ballistic missiles at England, I would expect that we would all be a little angry and we would fight back. And the reality is on October 7th, there was a terrible military terrorist intervention into Israel that cost thousands of lives, harmed many thousands of people. And those hostages there are something that is existential and to the core of the Israeli people and the ethos of the Jewish people. At the same time that happened, everybody wants to gloss over the fact that Hezbollah declared war and joined Hamas on October 8th and started firing missiles into Israel. And the portion of the Israeli nation that lived within range of those missiles had to move out of northern Israel away from the Lebanese border because of Hezbollah. If we had to abandon the Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota because Canada was firing ballistic missiles, or we had to empty Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico because Mexico was firing missiles at us, I would imagine there would be some harsh reactions by the United States. And I would suggest to you that if the same thing had happened to the British Isles from a hostile actor, the United Kingdom would feel the same way.
You've talked a lot about the Ayatollah in Iran. I wonder as well whether, there was this warning, wasn't there, by Iran to the US that this attack on Israel was imminent, which I think a lot of people have read into that perhaps, they're still hesitant for this to become a full-scale regional war and for Iran to truly play a role in that. I wonder whether there's an element of fear there from Iran, at least until they can get this nuclear weapon, that they've seen Israel take out the leader of Hezbollah. I think that was, unexpected. They've seen various attacks in recent weeks and months that perhaps they didn't know Israel was capable of. Do you think there's a fear that Israel could take out the Ayatollah himself?
Look, I do think that there is fear by the Iranians. I mean, you see them, they're seeing their proxies being eliminated one by one, and their ability to actually support their proxies is being questioned because I think they don't care about their proxies. Their proxies are cannon fodder. They want people to kill and die for them. They just want to be safe back in Tehran, ensure their dominion over the Iranian people, and stay in power. And I think they're being revealed. But what you said is you're conflating the two Iranian ballistic and drone attacks. In April, when Iran attacked with using multiple weapon systems, including drones, smaller missiles, and ballistic missiles, excuse me, it was telegraphed. And there's no doubt the Israelis knew to some degree what was coming, and the Americans. It was very clearly rejected by the Pentagon yesterday that there was any warning related to this attack by the Iranians. They did not give any advance notice. We have great intel, great satellite ability, and we knew not that far in advance that we're coming. And remember, these ballistic missiles take somewhere between 11 and 12 minutes, depending on where they're launched from in Iran, to hit Israel. There was no advance warning other than our intel, and that was made clear by the Pentagon yesterday. And I think that's why you're seeing a little bit in the change of the rhetoric coming out of the United States. I've grown weary of the tiresome, well, let's de-escalate and, engage in diplomacy, even though I fully agree with that principle. But this was an incredibly severe attack. and you're seeing the very weak Biden administration, who does not understand the concept of deterrence in the region. I don't think it understands its enemies or allies in the region, for that matter. And I think they are shaken by this, and they realize there has to be a response. I think the $64,000 question is whether or not they will have realized the folly of that failure to deter, understand the scale of this attack and its consequences, and participate in a serious manner with Israel in a comprehensive strike against Iranian military, missile, and nuclear facilities.
Having said all of what you said there, and I can understand this weariness around the diplomacy that you're talking about. Is there any world in which this can actually be concluded without diplomacy? Surely, no matter what happens in the next few weeks, in the end, talking is going to end this, right?
Look, I'm a former diplomat, but I think we have to be realistic. You probably have a toolbox in your house. You don't only use a flathead screwdriver to do whatever little tool you have to do. You probably have a Phillips head, you have a hammer, you have wrenches, and the like. The tools to deal with a rogue state, a hostile power, are really very few. And this political debate about what to do is utter nonsense and shows really the fissures of Western democracies because within them, because we polarize them. But a thoughtful discussion means that you engage in diplomacy. I fully support it. You engage in military planning, you engage in asymmetrical warfare, economic pressure. And you do all of those, and to a degree, to create the best toolbox to use against that power. I think because of politics, whenever you're attacked, if you are attacked repeatedly by a hostile neighbor and you say, "Can't we just talk this out?" And they keep attacking you, and you keep saying, "Can't we talk it out?" At some point, sadly, you have to punch them in the nose and punch back. I am not, I've never called for military strikes on Iran until October 7th, ever. I'm one of the leading advocates of economic pressure and cyber, and we've led the maximum pressure campaign, the concept of that for many, many years. But let's be very clear. The death, the destruction, the suffering that's been caused since 10/7 is at the feet of one man, the Ayatollah. And to say that you can talk it out with a terror group like Hezbollah or Hamas, remember Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, is buried in a bunker somewhere deep underground with hostages all around him. And he has said openly that he's willing to sacrifice the Palestinian people to destroy the state of Israel. Who says that you're willing to sacrifice your people in order to destroy another country? Who says that? So I think that we have to be realistic, that there are limits to that concept of de-escalating in diplomacy. And when you are the superpower, if you don't use the power and influence of the associations with that superpower, you are taking a significant number of tools out of your toolbox, and you're making your problem much more complicated. And I think it's weak, wrong, and a failure of the West and America to not understand that any sound policy has to include all those tools in the toolbox.
Because within the diplomacy discussion, there's always the UN, and this is an area of expertise of yourself, having worked within the UN for such a long time. I wonder how important you think the UN's role is in this. From the outside looking in, I always think it appears a bit toothless as an organisation, as a body. What power do you think it has now? How can it help bring this to as peaceful a conclusion as possible?
It has no power, none.
And you worked within the sort of reforming it, didn't you? So what changes are needed, or do you just close it down?
Well, it's not a question of closing it down. Look, I'm a critic of the UN because ostensibly I was an expert in efforts to make it more viable. But at the same time, I'm a little bit of a UN apologist. Like, I believe that UN peacekeeping missions in various places are useful because anytime that you can use a multinational peacekeeping force of countries that want to contribute troops for payment to solve problems around the world is a good thing. It's lower cost, and it's potentially not a bloody American boot in the ground or a bloody British boot in the ground. So I think that those peacekeeping missions are advantageous. But let's be serious. China or Russia are on the UN Security Council and exercise a veto. And the UN is utterly feckless on these issues. And there is an institutional anti-Semitism within the UN in a lot of ways. Interestingly, countries organized via regional organizations that are as passe as something from the 1960s, even though I enjoy retro things. Not retro isn't always good. And those regional alignments, were based upon, policies and beliefs that are very, very outdated. So I think that the UN is entirely irrelevant here, and it's been proven to be the case. And there is a latent anti-Semitism. Antonio Guterres, who is the Secretary General, I don't know him, but I mean, his history as who he was from Nicaragua is not a guy that is viewed as a serious person to do that. But ultimately, it's not his fault. The UN is a democracy of a bunch of countries that aren't democracies, including some democracies, and those countries use it to push issues and the like that are contrary to our interests. UN Security Council has no role here. There is no role. China and Russia exercise a veto, and we could have an entire separate multi-day discussion on the malign influence of Vladimir Putin and the complications that Xi Jinping and China bring to the world and the Security Council.
Just finally, Ambassador Wallace, I want to bring you back to where we started, and you've told me what you think should happen around the Middle East, what Israel should do next, the support it should have from the US. I just want to finish with what you think will happen.
I think that Israel, I'm very confident that Israel will strike back. I think that it will hit a variety of targets inside of Iran. I believe that the United States will participate. The question is what level of participation, and that's a key thing to watch. And I hope that I will be surprised and that my friends in the Biden administration, and I say that seriously, I have many friends there, understand that if this continues on this path, that it's much more dangerous, and participating in a strike back will make the likelihood of a greater conflict down the road less likely. So I think that will happen, and I think you'll see that happen soon. And the question is whether or not Iran will then respond again, and we could finally be seeing this coming to the climax of Iran's malign activities, the tenuous hold that the regime has on power, and Iran being revealed as the weak, malign influence that it is.
Ambassador Wallace, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.